The morning my father burst into laughter at the breakfast table, coffee nearly shooting out of his nose, I knew I had him exactly where I wanted him. "You bought a house?" he wheezed, wiping tears from his eyes. "Marcus, son, you can barely afford that beat-up Honda in the driveway." What he didn't know was that I'd been planning this moment for 3 years. And the house I'd bought? Well, let's just say it was closer to home than he could have ever imagined. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. Growing up in Millfield, Ohio, our house on Maple Street was everything to my dad, Richard Coleman. It wasn't just a home, it was his monument to success, his proof that a kid from the wrong side of the tracks could make something of himself. Every Saturday morning, you'd find him out front with a measuring tape, ensuring the grass was cut to exactly 2.5 inches. The white picket fence got a fresh coat of paint every spring, and God help you if you left fingerprints on the mailbox he'd installed himself. This house represents 30 years of hard work, he'd tell anyone who'd listen. 30 years of getting up at 5 a.m., 30 years of overtime shifts at the steel plant, 30 years of saving every penny. He'd run his calloused hands along the porch railing he'd built from scratch, pride radiating from every weathered line on his face. But that pride came with a price, especially for me and my younger sister, Emma. Dad had this way of making us feel like we were permanent disappointments, like we'd never measure up to his standards or achievements. When I graduated college with a business degree, his response wasn't congratulations. It was a lecture about how a degree doesn't mean anything without real-world experience. When Emma got accepted to nursing school, he questioned whether she was tough enough for the medical field. The breaking point came 3 years ago during what I now call the Thanksgiving disaster. Emma had just started her first job as a registered nurse, and I was working as a junior analyst at a financial consulting firm in Cleveland. We were both living in apartments, trying to build our own lives, but apparently, that wasn't good enough for Richard Coleman. "Look at you two," he said, carving the turkey with aggressive precision. 26 and 24 years old, throwing money away on rent every month. You know what I had at your age? A mortgage, responsibility, skin in the game. He pointed his carving knife toward the window overlooking his perfectly manicured backyard. This house taught me the value of ownership, of building something that lasts. Emma shifted uncomfortably in her chair. "Dad, we're doing fine. We're building our careers, saving money." "Saving money?" he laughed, but there was no warmth in it. "For what? Another vacation you can't afford? Another car payment? You're 30 years behind where I was at your age, and you don't even realize it." That's when he delivered the line that would echo in my head for the next 3 years. "Neither of you will ever own anything worth owning. You don't have what it takes to build real wealth, to make the sacrifices necessary for true success. This house right here is worth more than both of your annual salaries combined, and I built this life from nothing." I excused myself from the table and spent the rest of the evening walking around the neighborhood where I'd grown up, where every house held memories of childhood games and teenage dreams. But now, seeing it through adult eyes, I noticed things I'd never paid attention to before. The property tax assessments posted on utility poles, the for sale signs that seemed to linger longer than they used to, the subtle signs that Millfield was changing, that the economic boom that had built my father's version of the American dream was slowly fading. That night, lying in my childhood bedroom under faded baseball posters, I made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't going to argue with my father anymore. I wasn't going to try to prove my worth through explanations or achievements that he'd inevitably dismiss. I was going to prove it through action, through a move so bold and unexpected that he'd have no choice but to see me differently. The next morning, I drove back to Cleveland and immediately started researching. Not job opportunities or investment strategies, but something much more specific: the financial history of 847 Maple Street, Millfield, Ohio. What I discovered over the following weeks would become the foundation of the most elaborate long-term plan I'd ever conceived. My father's house, his pride and joy, his monument to 30 years of hard work, had a secret. And that secret was about to become my greatest advantage. Public records showed that Richard Coleman had indeed purchased the house in 1994 for $89,000. He'd put down 20% and financed the rest through Millfield Community Bank. Over the years, he'd refinanced twice, Once in 2008 during the financial crisis when interest rates dropped, and again in 2016 when he needed cash to replace the roof and update the plumbing. But here's what my father never told us, what he probably didn't even fully understand himself. By 2016, he'd borrowed so much against the house's equity that he owed nearly as much as it was worth. The refinancing hadn't just been for home improvements. It had been to consolidate credit card debt, to cover Emma's college tuition, to pay for the medical bills when Mom had her surgery 2 years before she passed away. My mother's death in 2019 had hit all of us hard, but it hit Dad's finances even harder. The funeral expenses, the medical bills that insurance didn't cover, the sudden loss of her income from the part-time job at the library, it all added up. What I discovered through careful research was that my proud, successful father was drowning in debt, using credit cards to make mortgage payments, robbing Peter to pay Paul every month. The house he was so proud of, the symbol of his success and our supposed failure, was mortgaged to the hilt. And according to the county records I accessed through my work connections, he was already 2 months behind on payments. That's when the real plan began to take shape. I started working overtime, picking up freelance consulting projects, and living on rice and beans to save every possible dollar. Emma, once I filled her in on what I'd discovered, started doing the same. We pooled our resources and began waiting for the inevitable. The foreclosure notice was filed on a Tuesday morning in March. By Thursday afternoon, I was sitting in the office of Margaret Chen, the attorney who'd become my secret weapon in this elaborate chess match with my father's pride. Margaret Chen's office smelled like leather and old books, the kind of place where serious business got done behind closed doors. She was younger than I expected for someone with her reputation, maybe 40. With sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and a handshake that could crush walnuts. "So let me get this straight," she said, spreading the foreclosure documents across her mahogany desk. "You want to purchase your father's house at auction, but you don't want him to know it's you bidding?" "That's exactly right. Is it legal?" She leaned back in her chair, studying me with the expression lawyers get when they're calculating billable hours. "It's perfectly legal, Marcus. Happens more often than you'd think, actually. Family members buying properties to prevent them from going to strangers, then working out private arrangements afterward." What she didn't say, but what we both understood, was that my situation was different. Most people doing this were trying to save their families from embarrassment. I was trying to teach my father a lesson he'd never forget. The foreclosure auction was scheduled for the first Tuesday in June. That gave me exactly 10 weeks to get my finances in order, which meant 10 weeks of living like a monk and working like a machine. Emma moved back in with Dad temporarily, ostensibly to help him around the house, but really to keep us informed about his state of mind and financial situation. "He's pretending everything is fine," she reported during one of our weekly phone calls. "But Marcus, he looks terrible. He's lost weight, and I found him sitting at the kitchen table at 3 a.m. last night, just staring at a stack of bills." Part of me felt guilty. This was my father, after all, the man who'd taught me to ride a bike and shown up to every Little League game, even after pulling double shifts. But then I'd remember Thanksgiving dinner, remember the dismissive laugh, remember 30 years of being told I'd never amount to anything. The truth was, Richard Coleman was about to lose his house anyway. At least this way, it would stay in the family. Margaret Chen earned every penny of her fee by setting up a shell company called Midwest Property Solutions, LLC. On paper, it looked like any other real estate investment firm. In reality, it was just me, Emma, and our combined life savings of $127,000. The county courthouse on auction day was exactly what you'd expect. A gray, imposing building that smelled like floor wax and broken dreams. About 30 people had showed up, most of them professional investors with clipboards and calculating expressions. I recognized a few local real estate agents, probably there on behalf of clients who'd identified the property as a potential flip. Standing in the back of the room wearing sunglasses and a baseball cap pulled low, I felt like a character in a movie. The auctioneer, a thin man with a voice like a carnival barker, called for attention. "Next property, 847 Maple Street, Millfield, Ohio. 3-bedroom, 2-bath colonial, approximately 1,800 square feet. Minimum bid starts at $98,000, which represents the outstanding mortgage balance plus fees. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure everyone could hear it. This was it. The moment 3 months of planning would either pay off or fall apart spectacularly. Do I hear $98,000? A man in an expensive suit raised his hand. Professional flipper, no doubt. He probably planned to gut the place and turn it into a rental property. $100,000, I called out, my voice steadier than I felt. The auctioneer's assistant, a bored-looking woman with a clipboard, made note of my bid. The man in the suit glanced in my direction, sizing up the competition. I tried to look casual, like I did this every day. $105,000, suit guy countered. $110,000, I responded immediately. This went on for about 10 minutes, the price climbing steadily. At $140,000, most of the other bidders dropped out. The house was worth maybe $160,000 in the current market, so the profit margins were getting thin for professional investors. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now back to where we left off. But I wasn't a professional investor, I was a son on a mission. $145,000, the man in the suit called out, but I could see the hesitation in his posture. He was reaching his limit. $150,000, I said, and the room went quiet. The auctioneer looked around, his carnival barker voice dropping to a more conversational tone. Do I hear $155,000? Anyone? $155,000? Silence. Going once, going twice. Sold to bidder number 47 for $150,000. I had just bought my childhood home. The paperwork took another hour, during which I had to resist the urge to call Emma immediately. Margaret Chen had prepared me for this part, the mundane reality of property transfers, title searches, and cashier's checks. By 4 p.m., I was walking out of the courthouse with a folder full of documents and the strangest feeling of my life. I owned the house my father had spent 30 years paying for. I owned his pride, his symbol of success, his monument to the American dream. But the hard part was just beginning. Emma was waiting for me at a coffee shop downtown, her nursing scrubs wrinkled from a long shift. She looked exhausted but excited, bouncing slightly in her chair as I approached. "Did you get it?" she whispered. I slid the deed across the table. Marcus Coleman, as trustee for Midwest Property Solutions LLC, is now the proud owner of 847 Maple Street. She stared at the document like it might disappear if she looked away. I can't believe we actually did this. What happens now? That was the question I'd been avoiding all day. Buying the house had been the easy part, relatively speaking. Now came the delicate matter of revealing the truth to our father without destroying what was left of our family. We wait, I said. Let him think he's going to be evicted by some faceless investment company. Let him stew in it for a while. Marcus, that's cruel. He's already barely eating, barely sleeping, if he thinks he's going to be homeless. He's not going to be homeless, I interrupted. That's the point, Emma. He's never going to be homeless, never going to lose the house he's so proud of. But he needs to understand what it feels like to not have control, to be at someone else's mercy for once. She was quiet for a long moment, tracing the rim of her coffee cup with her finger. You know this won't fix anything between you two, right? This won't make him proud of you or change the way he sees us. Maybe she was right. Maybe this elaborate plan was just an expensive way to prove a point that didn't need proving. But I'd come too far to back down now. There's something else, I said, pulling out another document Margaret Chen had prepared. The eviction notice goes out tomorrow. He has 30 days to vacate the premises. Emma's eyes widened. You're actually going to evict him, your own father? I'm going to make him think I'm evicting him. There's a difference. The next morning, I drove to my apartment in Cleveland and waited. I didn't have to wait long. My phone rang at 11:47 a.m. Marcus? Dad's voice was shaky, older than I'd ever heard it. Son, something's happened. Some company bought the house at auction yesterday. I just got served with an eviction notice. I took a deep breath, steadying myself for what came next. What do you mean, eviction notice? 30 days, Marcus. After 30 years in this house, I have 30 days to pack up my life and find somewhere else to go. The pain in his voice was real, raw, and for a moment I almost cracked. Almost told him the truth right then and there. But I thought about Thanksgiving dinner, about all the times he'd made Emma and me feel small, about his certainty that we'd never amount to anything. Dad, I'm so sorry. Is there anything I can do to help? There was a long pause, and when he spoke again, his voice was barely a whisper. I don't know, son. I honestly don't know. The weeks that followed were the longest of my life. Every phone call from Dad was a knife twist. Every update from Emma, a reminder that my elaborate revenge plan was breaking down the strongest man I'd ever known. But I held my ground, even as doubt crept in like water through cracks in a foundation. Dad started selling everything. First it was Mom's jewelry, the pieces he'd bought her for anniversaries and birthdays over the years. Then came his tools, the craftsman set he'd accumulated over decades, each wrench and screwdriver a small investment in his identity as a man who could fix anything. Emma found him in the garage one Saturday morning, sitting on an overturned milk crate, holding his father's old level like it was a sacred relic. Grandpa Pete gave me this when I bought my first house, he told Emma, his weathered hands trembling slightly. Said a man needs to know when things are straight and true. Guess I lost track of that somewhere along the way. The garage sale was scheduled for the third weekend in June. I drove down from Cleveland and parked 3 blocks away, watching from a distance as strangers rifled through the physical remnants of Richard Coleman's carefully constructed life. His workbench sold for $45 to a teenager who probably had no idea he was buying 30 years of Saturday morning projects. Mom's china cabinet went for $60, the buyer immediately discussing how she'd strip the stain and paint it white for her farmhouse kitchen. But it was watching Dad negotiate over his recliner that nearly broke me. The old brown Lasboy had been his command center for as long as I could remember, where he'd watched football games and helped us with homework, where he'd dozed off during evening news broadcasts with his reading glasses sliding down his nose. A young couple with a baby wanted it for their nursery, and Dad was asking $80. Would you take $50? The woman asked, rocking a sleeping infant in her arms. Dad looked at the chair, then at the baby, then back at the chair. Tell you what, he said softly, take it for $40. That little one needs a good chair to grow up in. I sat in my Honda, windows cracked, watching my proud father sell his comfort for less than it was worth to help young parents he'd never see again. This was the same man who'd lectured me about financial responsibility, about making smart decisions and understanding value. Yet here he was, essentially giving away pieces of himself because he thought it was the right thing to do. That night, I called Margaret Chen. I want to call this off, I told her. Send him a letter saying the investment company changed their mind, that he can stay. Marcus, she said, her lawyer voice kicking in, you're 3 weeks into this. If you back out now without any explanation, he's gonna know something's up. The timing will be too convenient. She was right, of course. Dad wasn't stupid. If some mysterious company suddenly developed a heart and let him stay without cause, he'd start asking questions. And the answers to those questions would lead directly back to me. Besides, Margaret continued, you've already achieved what you set out to do. He's experienced what it feels like to lose everything, to be powerless. Isn't that enough? But watching him sell Mom's wedding ring at that pawn shop on Tuesday afternoon, Emma had told me about it in a tearful phone call. I realized that maybe revenge was a dish best not served at all. The breaking point came the following Thursday. Emma called me at work, crying so hard I could barely understand her. He's at the bank, Marcus. He's trying to get a loan using his truck as collateral, the same truck he's been driving for 15 years, the one he swore he'd drive until it died. He thinks maybe if he can come up with enough money, he can negotiate with the investment company. That truck was more than transportation to Dad. It was his mobile office, his weekend adventure vehicle, his connection to the version of himself that could still climb ladders and haul lumber. The idea of him risking it in a desperate attempt to save a house I already owned made my stomach turn. I left work early and drove straight to Millfield Community Bank. Sure enough, there was Dad's faded blue Ford in the parking lot, rust spots on the wheel wells like age spots on aging hands. Through the window, I could see him sitting across from a loan officer, his shoulders hunched in that defeated posture I'd been seeing too much of lately. For 45 minutes I sat in that parking lot, engine running, air conditioning, battling the June heat, trying to decide what kind of son I wanted to be. The kind who taught hard lessons through elaborate schemes, or the kind who protected his father from his own pride, even when that father had spent years crushing his children's dreams. When Dad finally emerged from the bank, the look on his face told me everything I needed to know about how that meeting had gone. He walked to his truck like a man heading to his own execution, climbed in without his usual care, and sat there for a long moment with his forehead pressed against the steering wheel. That's when I made a decision that would change everything again. I followed him home, staying far enough back to avoid detection, and watched him pull into the driveway of 847 Maple Street, my house now, though he didn't know it. Instead of going inside, he walked around to the backyard, to the garden where Mom used to grow tomatoes, and where he'd built a small wooden bench under the old oak tree. He sat on that bench for 2 hours. I know because I parked at the end of the street and waited, watching my father contemplate the loss of everything he'd worked for. Occasionally, he'd look up at the house, at the windows he'd installed himself, at the gutters he cleaned every fall, at the small front porch where he'd taught me to throw a curveball. As the sun started to set, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange that Mom would have loved, I saw Dad pull out his phone. Even from a distance, I could see his hands shaking as he dialed. My phone rang. "Marcus," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen without interrupting." "Okay, Dad." "I've made a lot of mistakes as a father. I've been hard on you and Emma, probably too hard. I thought I was teaching you to be strong, to be independent, but maybe I was just scared that if I didn't push you, you'd end up like me." "Dad, what do you mean like you? You're successful, you built a good life." He was quiet for a long moment, and I could hear him breathing, the same measured breaths he used to take before delivering difficult news when we were kids. "Son, I'm about to lose everything. The house, maybe the truck, probably my credit rating. At 62 years old, I'm starting over with nothing. You know what that makes me? It makes me a failure, a man who couldn't even hold on to the one thing he was supposed to protect." The words hit me like physical blows. This wasn't the proud, dismissive father I'd been trying to humble. This was a broken man who'd already learned the lesson I was trying to teach him, learned it the hard way through circumstances beyond his control. "But here's what I want you to understand," he continued, his voice growing stronger. "You and Emma, you're both doing better than I did at your age. You have education, opportunities, and a whole future ahead of you. I was wrong to make you feel small, wrong to act like my struggles were somehow more important than your achievements." I sat in my car at the end of Maple Street, tears streaming down my face, realizing that my elaborate plan had become something I never intended, a form of torture inflicted on a man who was already suffering. "Dad," I said, my voice barely a whisper, "I need to tell you something too." The silence on the other end of the phone stretched for what felt like hours. I could hear Dad breathing, could picture him sitting on Mom's old bench in the backyard, probably wondering what his failure of a son was about to confess now. "What is it, Marcus?" My hands were sweating so badly I almost dropped the phone. 3 months of planning, 3 months of elaborate deception, and it all came down to this moment. I could keep lying, let him think some faceless corporation was destroying his life. Or I could tell the truth and deal with whatever came next. "Dad, I need you to stay exactly where you are. Don't move, don't go inside, just stay on that bench, I'm coming over." "Marcus, what's going on? You're scaring me. Just trust me for once, please." I hung up and drove the 3 blocks to Maple Street with my heart hammering against my ribs. Dad was exactly where I'd left him, silhouetted against the evening sky, looking smaller somehow than the larger-than-life figure who dominated my childhood. He stood up when he saw me walking across the yard, confusion written across his weathered features. "Son, what are you doing here? How did you get here so fast?" I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the folder Margaret Chen had prepared, the one containing every document related to the purchase of 847 Maple Street. My hands were shaking as I held it out to him. "Dad, remember last month when I told you I bought a house and you laughed? You said I could barely afford my car payments, that I'd never own anything worth owning?" He took the folder but didn't open it, his eyes never leaving mine. Marcus, what is this? Open it. He did, slowly, his calloused fingers fumbling with the legal papers. I watched his face as understanding dawned, watched 30 years of pride and prejudice crumble in real time. The deed was on top, my name clearly visible as the new owner of his beloved home. You, his voice was barely a whisper, you bought my house? I bought your house, Dad, at auction, 3 weeks ago. He sank back onto the bench like his legs had given out, the papers scattered around him like fallen leaves. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. A neighbor's dog barked in the distance. And someone was running a lawnmower 2 houses down. Normal suburban sounds that felt surreal against the backdrop of our family's nuclear moment. Why? He finally asked, and there was something in his voice I'd never heard before. Not anger, not disappointment, but something closer to wonder. I sat down beside him on the bench Mom had loved so much, close enough to smell his familiar combination of Old Spice and motor oil. Because you hurt me, Dad. For years, you made Emma and me feel like we weren't good enough, weren't smart enough, weren't successful enough to earn your respect. He was staring at the deed, reading and rereading the words as if they might change. So you decided to humiliate me? I decided to prove you wrong. I decided to show you that your kids, the ones you thought would never amount to anything, could actually save the thing you loved most in the world. That's when he started crying. Not the quiet, dignified tears you might expect from a man of his generation, but deep, body-shaking sobs that seemed to come from 30 years of pent-up emotion. I'd never seen my father cry, not even at Mom's funeral, and watching him break down completely was both heartbreaking and terrifying. I'm sorry, he choked out between sobs. Jesus, Marcus, I'm so sorry, you're right. I was a terrible father. I was so afraid of you kids failing that I never gave you credit for succeeding. And now, God, now you had to save me from my own stupidity. I put my arm around his shoulders, feeling how thin he'd gotten over the past few weeks, how the stress had literally diminished him. Dad, you weren't a terrible father. You were complicated and sometimes hurtful, but you taught me everything I used to make this happen. Work ethic, determination, the importance of planning ahead. I learned all of that from you. He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, leaving streaks on his cheeks. How much did you pay? $150,000. He winced like I'd slapped him. Jesus, that's more than I made in 3 years when you were little. How did you even get that kind of money? Emma and I saved everything. We lived like we were broke for months, worked extra jobs, sold everything we could. We pooled our resources and made it happen. Emma knew? She was the one who convinced me to go through with it when I started having second thoughts. He picked up the deed again, studying it more carefully this time. So what happens now? Do I pay you rent? Do you kick me out anyway? That was the question I'd been dreading because honestly, I hadn't thought that far ahead. The plan had always been to reveal the truth eventually, but I'd never worked out the practical details of what came after the big revelation. Dad, this is still your house. It's always been your house. I own the paperwork now. That's not how ownership works, Marcus. If your name is on the deed, it's your house. Legally, emotionally, practically, it's yours. He was right, of course. In my determination to prove a point, I'd fundamentally altered the dynamics of our family. The house where he'd raised his children, where he'd grieved his wife, where he'd planned to spend his retirement, I now controlled all of it. What if we work out a payment plan, I suggested. You could buy it back from me over time, maybe at a reduced rate. With what money? He laughed, but there was no humor in it. Marcus, I just spent the last 3 weeks selling everything I own to try to come up with cash. I mortgaged this place to the hilt to pay for your mother's medical bills and your sister's education. I've got maybe $800 in checking and a truck that's worth less than what I owe on it. The weight of what I'd done was starting to sink in. I'd wanted to teach him a lesson about humility, about respecting his children's achievements. Instead, I'd created a situation where he was essentially homeless and dependent on my charity. There has to be a solution, I said, more to myself than to him. There is a solution, he said quietly. You let your old man live here as long as he's able, and maybe in exchange he finally starts treating his kids like the adults they are. We sat in comfortable silence as the sun finished setting, both of us processing the magnitude of what had just happened. I thought about all the conversations we'd never had, all the times I'd wished he would see me as more than just a disappointment. Now I had his attention, his respect, and maybe even his gratitude. But it had come at a cost neither of us had anticipated. "Marcus," he said eventually, "can I ask you something?" "Sure." "When you were planning all of this, when you were saving money and researching auction procedures and hiring lawyers, were you angry the whole time? Or was there a part of you that was excited about surprising me?" I thought about it, really thought about it. Honestly, I think I was both. Angry about Thanksgiving, about all the times you made me feel small. But also, yeah, I was excited. I kept imagining your face when you realized what I'd done, how proud you'd be that your son had pulled off something this complicated. He nodded slowly. "You know what's funny? I am proud, terrified, confused, maybe a little embarrassed, but proud. What you did here, the planning and execution and financial discipline, that's the kind of thing I always hoped you'd be capable of. I just never imagined it would be at my expense. Dad, I never wanted to hurt you. I just wanted you to see me differently." "Well," he said, standing up and gathering the scattered papers, "mission accomplished. Though next time you want to impress your old man, maybe just buy yourself a house and invite me over for dinner." We both laughed at that, the first genuine laughter I'd heard from either of us in weeks. It felt like the beginning of something new, though I wasn't sure yet what that something would look like. The next morning brought an unexpected phone call that would complicate everything even further. I was sitting in my Cleveland apartment, nursing my second cup of coffee, and trying to figure out how to explain to my boss why I needed another day off, when Margaret Chen's number appeared on my screen. "Marcus, we have a problem," she said without preamble. "I just got off the phone with the county assessor's office. There's been a development with your property." My stomach dropped. "What kind of development?" "Your neighbors filed a complaint. Apparently your father's garage sale and the general distress of the situation has attracted attention. Someone reported that the property appears to be in distress, possibly abandoned. They're sending an inspector next week. But Dad's living there, it's not abandoned." "I know that, and you know that, but from the outside, it might look different. Empty rooms, missing furniture, general upheaval, these things can trigger city ordinances about property maintenance." I rubbed my temples, feeling a headache building. "What does that mean practically?" "If the inspector finds violations, the city can impose fines or even force improvements to bring the property up to code. And Marcus, those improvements could cost thousands of dollars. Money that neither you nor your father currently has readily available." After hanging up with Margaret, I sat staring at my phone, realizing that my elaborate revenge plot had created problems I'd never anticipated. It wasn't enough that I owned Dad's house. Now I had to actively maintain it to city standards or risk losing it altogether. I called Emma at the hospital where she worked, catching her between shifts. "The city's sending an inspector?" she asked after I explained the situation. "Marcus, the house looks terrible right now. Half the furniture is gone, Dad hasn't been keeping up with maintenance, and the whole place just has this defeated energy to it." "How bad is it, specifically?" "Well, the front porch railing is loose, has been for months. Some of the window screens have holes, the gutters need cleaning, and there's a section of fence in the backyard that's about to fall over. Nothing major, but enough little things to give the impression that nobody cares about the property anymore." That afternoon, I did something I hadn't done in years. I called in sick to work and drove to the hardware store. If I was going to own this house, I was going to make sure it met every possible city standard. Dad was in the garage when I arrived, sitting on an overturned bucket and staring at the empty shelves where his tools used to be. He looked up when I walked in, carrying bags from Home Depot, his expression shifting from surprise to confusion to something that might have been hope. "What's all this?" he asked. "We've got a city inspection next week. The house needs some work, and since I'm technically the owner now, I'm technically responsible for bringing it up to code." He stood up slowly, his knees creaking in the way that reminded me he wasn't the invincible man I'd grown up believing he was. Marcus, you don't know how to fix these things. No offense, but you've always been more of a numbers guy than a hands-on guy. Then teach me. Those 3 words hung in the air between us, carrying the weight of 30 years of missed opportunities. Dad had always been eager to share his knowledge about home maintenance and repair, but I'd always been too busy, or too disinterested, or too proud to learn. Now, faced with the very real possibility of losing the house I'd worked so hard to acquire, I was finally ready to listen. "All right," he said, walking over to examine the contents of my shopping bags, "but we're going to do this right. No shortcuts, no half measures. If we're going to fix this place up, we're going to fix it properly." The next 5 days were unlike anything I'd ever experienced with my father. Every morning, I'd drive down from Cleveland and we'd work together until sunset, methodically addressing every issue that might concern a city inspector. Dad proved to be a patient teacher, walking me through each repair with the kind of detailed explanation I'd always dismissed as unnecessary when I was younger. "See, the thing about this railing," he said as we worked on the front porch, "is that it's not just about making it look good. It's about safety, about building something that'll last. Your mother used to lean on this railing every evening, watching you kids play in the yard. I want to know that if Emma's kids ever come to visit, this railing will still be solid enough to hold them." Emma's kids. It was the first time either of us had talked about the future in concrete terms. About the possibility that life would continue beyond this crisis, that there might be grandchildren who would play in this yard someday. "Dad," I said, pausing in my sanding of the railing posts, "do you think Emma will have kids?" "I hope so. She's got a good heart, your sister. She'd make a wonderful mother." He looked up from the section he was working on. "What about you? You ever think about having a family?" It was a conversation we'd never had, one of hundreds of conversations we'd avoided over the years, in favor of arguments about my life choices and his expectations. "Sometimes. I guess I always figured I'd need to get my own life together first." "Son, if there's one thing I've learned from this whole mess, it's that nobody ever really has their life completely together. You just do the best you can with what you've got and hope it's enough." By Thursday afternoon, the house looked better than it had in months. Fresh paint on the porch, new screens in the windows, gutters cleaned and repaired, fence posts reinforced, and every minor maintenance issue addressed. More importantly, Dad looked better too. Having a project to focus on, having his knowledge valued and needed, seemed to restore some of the vitality that stress had drained from him. The city inspector arrived on Friday morning at exactly 9 a.m., an efficient-looking woman in her 40s, with a clipboard and a no-nonsense attitude. Dad and I waited nervously on the front porch as she walked around the property, making notes and occasionally taking photographs. "The property is well maintained," she announced after completing her circuit. "I'm not seeing any code violations. There was a complaint filed, but frankly, whoever filed it was either mistaken or being vindictive. This is a solid, well-cared-for home." After she left, Dad and I stood in the driveway, both of us grinning like idiots who'd just passed the most important test of our lives. "We did it," I said. "Yeah, we did." He looked at the house, then at me, then back at the house. "Marcus, can I tell you something?" "Sure." "These past few days, working together like this, it's the most fun I've had since your mother died. I know that sounds crazy, given everything that's happened, but having a project to work on with my son, teaching you things I thought you'd never want to learn, it's been good." I felt something shifting in my chest, some knot of resentment and hurt that had been there so long I'd stopped noticing it. "It's been good for me too, Dad. I'm sorry it took me buying your house to figure out how to talk to you." "Well," he said, wiping his hands on an old rag, "at least now I know you're capable of grand gestures. Though next time you want to prove a point, maybe just show up with a toolbox instead of a deed." That evening, we ordered pizza and ate it sitting on the front porch, admiring our work and talking about everything except the elephant in the room. What happened next? I owned his house, he had no money to buy it back, and we'd spent a week pretending that working together had somehow solved the fundamental problem of our new reality. But as the sun set over Maple Street, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold, I realized that maybe the problem wasn't as complicated as I'd been making it. Maybe the solution had been right in front of us all along. 3 weeks after the city inspection, I found myself sitting across from financial advisor David Walsh in his downtown Cleveland office, trying to explain a situation that sounded like the plot of a soap opera. Walsh was a friend from college who'd built a reputation for creative solutions to complicated family financial problems, but even he seemed puzzled by my predicament. "So let me get this straight," he said, adjusting his glasses and reviewing the notes he'd been taking. "You own your father's house, but you want him to live there permanently. He can't afford to buy it back, but you don't want to just give it to him because that would create tax implications and potentially hurt his pride. And you're both emotionally invested in finding a solution that preserves family relationships while making financial sense." "That's exactly right. Is there a way to structure this that works for everyone?" David leaned back in his leather chair, the kind of expensive furniture that whispered about successful investment strategies and compound interest. "Actually, there are several options. The question is which one fits your family's specific dynamics." Over the next hour, he outlined possibilities I'd never considered. A lease-to-own arrangement where Dad would gradually buy back equity over time. A family trust that would protect the property while allowing him to live there indefinitely. Even a reverse mortgage structure that could provide him with monthly income while securing his right to remain in the house. But it was his fourth suggestion that stopped me cold. "What if you turned this into a legitimate business partnership?" David asked. "Your father clearly has skills in home maintenance and repair. You have capital and business acumen. What if you bought distressed properties together, fixed them up, and sold them for profit?" "You mean like flipping houses?" "Exactly. But not the kind you see on TV, where everything gets granite countertops and subway tile. I'm talking about buying foreclosed properties, bringing them up to code, and selling them to families who need affordable housing. Your father provides the expertise and labor, you provide the initial investment, and handle the business side." The idea was so simple it was brilliant. Dad would get to do what he loved, working with his hands, solving problems, building things that lasted. I would get to use my financial education in a way that actually mattered. And we'd be working together instead of against each other. "The beauty of this arrangement," David continued, "is that it gives your father equity in the business without requiring him to buy back his own house. The house becomes your shared headquarters, and the profits from your other projects fund both your futures." I left David Walsh's office with a proposal that seemed too good to be true, and a growing excitement about possibilities I'd never imagined. But first, I had to sell the idea to the most important person in the equation, and Dad had never been easy to convince of anything. I found him that evening in the backyard, installing a bird feeder near Mom's old rose bushes. It was a small thing, but it suggested he was thinking about the future again, about creating something pleasant and lasting. "Dad, I've been thinking about our situation, and I have an idea that might sound crazy at first." He looked up from the feeder, wariness creeping into his expression. "Marcus, please tell me you're not planning another elaborate surprise. I don't think my heart can take it." I laughed, despite my nerves. "No surprises this time, just a straightforward business proposition." I explained David Walsh's suggestion, watching Dad's face carefully for signs of interest or skepticism. He listened without interrupting, occasionally nodding or frowning as he processed the implications. "So you want us to become business partners," he said when I finished. "Buy houses, fix them up, sell them for profit." "That's the basic idea. You'd handle the construction and renovation side, I'd handle the financing and sales. We'd split the profits according to whatever arrangement feels fair." He was quiet for a long moment, testing the bird feeder's stability with small adjustments. "Marcus, do you have any idea how much work is involved in renovating a house? We're not talking about fixing a loose railing or cleaning some gutters. We're talking about electrical systems, plumbing, structural repairs, permits, inspections." "That's why I need you. I know I don't have those skills, but I can learn. And more importantly, I can handle the parts you don't want to deal with. The paperwork, the financing, the marketing." "And what happens when we disagree about something? When you think we should use cheap materials to maximize profit and I think we should do things right?" It was a fair question, one that got to the heart of our relationship and all the ways we'd failed to communicate over the years. Then we talk it out like adults, like business partners who respect each other's expertise. He finished adjusting the bird feeder and stepped back to admire his work. You know, your mother always said you and I were more alike than either of us wanted to admit. Said we were both stubborn and proud and too smart for our own good. Was she right? Probably, but maybe that's not entirely a bad thing. He turned to face me directly. If we're going to do this, we do it professionally. Written contracts, clear responsibilities, regular meetings to review progress and finances. I won't be the junior partner in some charity arrangement designed to make you feel better about owning my house. I wouldn't want it any other way. And we start small, one property, maybe two, until we figure out if we can actually work together without killing each other. Agreed. He extended his hand for a shake, his grip firm and calloused and familiar. All right, son, let's see if we can build something together. The next morning, I called Margaret Chen to set up the legal framework for Coleman & Son Property Development, a name that felt both professional and personal, acknowledging our partnership while honoring the family connection that had brought us to this point. Within a week, we had our first target, a 3-bedroom ranch house on the east side of Millfield that had been sitting empty for 8 months. The previous owners had walked away after a job loss, leaving behind a property that needed about $15,000 in repairs but could sell for $40,000 more than we'd pay for it. The bones are good, Dad said after our initial walkthrough. The foundation's solid, the roof's newer, and the layout makes sense. Mostly cosmetic work. Paint, flooring, some kitchen updates. Maybe 6 weeks of work if we do it right. Standing in that empty living room, surrounded by the smell of old carpet and possibility, I felt something I'd never experienced before. Genuine partnership with my father. Not the reluctant cooperation of family obligations, but the excited collaboration of two people who brought complementary skills to a shared vision. So I said, pulling out the purchase agreement David Walsh had helped me prepare, are we really doing this? Dad looked around the room one more time, mentally cataloging the work ahead of us. Yeah, he said with a grin that reminded me of the man who'd taught me to ride a bike and throw a baseball. I think we really are. The house on Maple Street had brought us to this moment, through anger and revenge and reconciliation and, finally, to something that looked remarkably like hope. I still owned Dad's home, but now it felt less like a weapon I'd used against him, and more like the foundation for something we were building together. As we signed the paperwork that would make us official business partners, I realized that sometimes the best revenge isn't proving someone wrong. It's proving that you're both capable of being better than you were before. 18 months later, I was standing in the kitchen of our 7th completed renovation, watching Dad explain proper cabinet installation to a young couple who'd just put in an offer $20,000 above our asking price. The transformation wasn't just in the houses we'd been flipping, it was in us. The key, Dad was telling the husband, a guy about my age who reminded me of myself 2 years earlier, is taking time to do things right the first time. These cabinets will outlast the next 3 owners if they're properly maintained. Sarah and Mike Henderson had been looking for their first home for 8 months when they found our listing for 342 Pine Street. Like most of our buyers, they were young professionals who wanted something move-in ready but couldn't afford the premium prices in Cleveland's trendier neighborhoods. Our renovated properties filled that gap perfectly. Quality work at honest prices in neighborhoods with potential. Mr. Coleman, Sarah said to Dad, can I ask you something? We've looked at probably 30 houses, and this is the first time the seller has spent an hour explaining how everything works. Why do you do that? Dad glanced at me, and I saw something in his expression that had taken months to develop. Pride in our work, satisfaction in doing something meaningful together. Because, he said, when you put this much effort into rebuilding something, you want to make sure the next owners understand what they're getting. A house should be more than just a place to sleep. It should be a foundation for building a good life. After the Hendersons left with promises to have their financing squared away by Friday, Dad and I walked through the empty house one more time, doing our final quality check. It had become our routine. This quiet moment after potential buyers left, when we'd examine our work with fresh eyes and discuss what we'd learned. You know what I figured out? Dad said, running his hand along the smooth surface of the kitchen island we'd built together. All those years I spent lecturing you and Emma about hard work and building something that lasts, I never actually showed you what that looked like. I just expected you to absorb it somehow. Dad, you taught us plenty, we just weren't ready to listen. Maybe. But working together like this, seeing how you handle the business side while I focus on the construction, It makes me realize what we could have been doing all along if I hadn't been so caught up in being the authority figure all the time. Our partnership had evolved organically over the past year and a half. Dad handled all the hands-on renovation work, from initial assessments to final walkthroughs. I managed financing, permits, scheduling, and sales. Emma had become our unofficial marketing director, using her natural people skills to help potential buyers envision themselves in our properties. The numbers were better than either of us had dared hope. 7 completed renovations, average profit of $32,000 per house, and a growing reputation in the region for quality work and fair dealing. More importantly, we'd developed a rhythm that played to both our strengths without triggering the old patterns of criticism and defensiveness. Speaking of business, I said, pulling out my phone to check our latest bank statement, we just got the final payment from the Pine Street sale. After expenses and setting aside funds for the next project, we're looking at $18,000 in profit to split. Dad whistled low. $18,000 for 6 weeks of work. Your mother would have thought we'd lost our minds, making this kind of money fixing up old houses. She would have been proud, Dad, you know she would have. We locked up the Pine Street house and drove back to Maple Street in comfortable silence, both of us tired but satisfied. It was a Thursday evening in late September, the kind of perfect autumn weather that made Ohio feel like the most beautiful place on earth. Emma's car was in the driveway when we arrived, which had become a regular occurrence since she'd started helping with our business. She was sitting at the kitchen table with her laptop open, surrounded by the kind of organized chaos that seemed to follow her everywhere. "How did the showing go?" she asked, without looking up from her screen. "They're putting in an offer tomorrow," Dad said, grabbing a beer from the refrigerator. 20 above asking, cash financing, want to close in 3 weeks. That's fantastic, and perfect timing because I found our next project. She turned her laptop around to show us a listing that had just appeared on the market. 4-bedroom colonial about 10 minutes from here, needs everything. Kitchen, bathrooms, flooring, paint. But the structure is solid, and the price is right. I studied the photos, automatically calculating repair costs and potential profit margins. What's the story? Elderly couple moved to assisted living. Family just wants it sold quickly so they can settle the estate. The listing agent says they'll consider any reasonable offer. Dad leaned over my shoulder to get a better look at the screen. That's the old Brennan place. I know that house. Helped Tom Brennan replace his roof about 15 years ago. Good bones, but it's been neglected for a while. So what do you think? Emma asked. Worth a look. Definitely, I said. Can you set up a showing for this weekend? As Emma made notes in her project planning spreadsheet, she'd developed a whole system for tracking our renovations that was more sophisticated than anything I'd learned in business school. I found myself thinking about how dramatically our family had changed. A year and a half ago, I'd bought Dad's house as an act of revenge, a way to prove that his disappointing son was more capable than he'd ever imagined. Now that same house served as headquarters for a business that had given all 3 of us something we'd been missing, a sense of purpose and partnership that felt both profitable and meaningful. Hi all. Marcus, Dad said, settling into his chair at the kitchen table, there's something I've been wanting to discuss with both of you. Emma and I exchanged glances. Dad's something to discuss conversations had historically been lectures about our life choices, but his tone suggested this was different. I've been thinking about the house situation, he continued, about the fact that Marcus technically owns this place, but I live here. It's been working fine, but it's not official. And if we're going to keep growing this business, we need everything to be properly structured. What are you suggesting? I asked. I'm suggesting we formalize everything. Set up a proper business partnership agreement that includes the house as a company asset. That way, it belongs to all of us and serves as our business headquarters. No more weird family dynamics about who owns what. Emma looked up from her laptop. That actually makes a lot of sense, and it would probably have tax advantages too. I thought about it, realizing that Dad was essentially proposing to solve the one remaining awkwardness in our arrangement. The house would become part of our shared business rather than a source of complicated family obligations. I like it, I said. Margaret Chen can draw up the paperwork. Good, Dad said, raising his beer in a small toast, to Coleman & Son Property Development, and to doing things the right way from now on. As we clinked bottles around the kitchen table, I caught sight of my reflection in the window and barely recognized the person looking back at me. 18 months ago, I'd been an angry son trying to prove a point through elaborate revenge. Now I was a business partner, working alongside my father to build something that mattered. The house on Maple Street had started this journey, but it wasn't the destination. The real prize had been learning that sometimes the best way to prove your worth isn't through grand gestures or complicated schemes. It's through showing up every day and doing good work alongside the people who matter most. Dad was right about one thing. When you put enough effort into rebuilding something, whether it's a house or a relationship, you want to make sure it's built to last. And what we'd built together, through all the anger and pride and eventual forgiveness, felt like something that could withstand whatever came next. Outside, the first leaves were beginning to turn, painting Maple Street in shades of gold and red that Mom would have loved. Inside, 3 people who'd almost lost each other were planning their next project, their next chance to take something broken and make it beautiful again. Sometimes the best revenge really is living well. But even better than living well is learning to build something meaningful with the people who drove you to revenge in the first place. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.